Didn't have to worry about that years ago or spend much time worrying about it because we had all of the natural biological controls that took care of it. That's why we could use crop rotation or crop sequence, a lot of those things. We've eliminated those with this very powerful antibiotic. Eliminated them, as I mentioned yesterday, in our gastrointestinal tract. We no longer have that protection, and so we see all of the changes in permeability of the intestinal lining, the leaky gut, the deterioration of those tissues by Clostridium and by Salmonella and Escherichia coli and those other pathogens that now are essentially out of control because we've removed the barriers that used to keep them contained in fairly innocuous farms. Again, as a chelator for plant production, a powerful herbicide, but it chelates in the tank, chelates in the plant, and chelates in the soil. You may have shifted from conventional to organic in the last 5 or 6 years. I'd wager to say you probably still have some glyphosate use if you were a traditional farmer, or some residue in there, but it's probably immobilized fairly effectively by chelation with the calcium and magnesium and other soil minerals, so that it's not an active ingredient. You can see the power of that chelation, not just had a graduate student that said, well, gee, we ought to be able to challenge that real quick. We should be able to challenge that very quickly if we just, let's add some zinc or some manganese. And if you read the label, it says don't do that because they knew that it would destroy the herbicidal activity. Chelates in the tank, and chelates in the plant. And that's what you see. We just added those zinc to the herbicide spray tank, and you lose that very excellent weed control that you would have had. That's where you need a GPS unit so you can find your corn plants. Close your plots because that giant ragweed, bigweed, are going to be taller than the corn is in another week or two. But it chelates in the plant. That's why you see the flashing. And very importantly, the reason why it isn't considered a persistent chemical from toxicity standpoint, because it chelates in the soil and not necessarily degraded. Some data from one of your scientists out of Canada, Dr. Farnhorst, her group, and you see 2 real factors or conditions that are going to determine what its persistence is going to be. One of those is going to be soil pH, so that as you get down into the lower pH ranges, you'll see a much greater sorption or absorption of your glyphosate in the clay structure or your soil structure, so it's going to be bound more tightly. The other component here is clay content. So the higher the clay content in your soil, the more glyphosate that can be sequestered or stored in the lattice structure of the clay component of your soil. Those 2 factors also make it more difficult for exposure to the soil microorganisms, so it gives it a longer persistence. In a sandy soil, high moisture, it can have a much shorter lifetime by literally years compared to a high clay loam soil. You have a 30-year accumulation or 30-year use of glyphosate accumulation, and you can have conditions like occurred in Saskatchewan last year. I had met with several growers, and they had a good year. They were able to apply if the phosphorus fertilizer rates up, and found that their wheat and barley only got about this high before it died from toxicity. And as Watt and others have shown, that the more phosphorus fertilizer you put out, the greater your desorption of that glyphosate that's been immobilized in the soil. Well, that may increase its microbial degradation in the long term, but it also exposes those plants to a very serious chelator and toxicant then in the intermediate phases. So with wheat and barley, one farmer had peas that hardly made it out of the ground while they were killed. But you see that reduction or that chelating then with all of your cations. Doesn't take very much, 12 grams per acre, a half an ounce per acre. Good uptake is enough. In fact, half that 12 grams is from a foliar drip application of 1/40th of the herbicidal rate for that 12 grams. Glyphosate uptake from the soil is much more damaging through the root system than it is from foliar application. So you see a shorter root system, much greater damage there, and that's what we're relying on to scavenge the soil for some of the poorly absorbed nutrients like phosphorus and manganese. Iron has a very dynamic biological component to it also. And you see the effect, even though phosphorus is, shifted a little, but phosphorus is, again, an anion, PO4, but you see an antagonism with the PO3 of glyphosate inhibiting also the uptake of phosphorus. So it has some very profound effects on that. Again, just from a foliar application, you can see the reduction. So that I was involved in a lawsuit on potatoes where they were demonstrating damage from an aerial application of glyphosate as a desiccant or a ripening agent 3 miles away to damage the seed production or the viability of that seed in the potato field that was used the next year and left about 40% of the hills empty, and you get that cluster of sprouts coming up when it does sprout, but no roots on them. Tremendous damage at very low rates. Potatoes are very sensitive to glyphosate injury, especially if it's going to be used as a seed crop. So, doesn't take very much. It moves for quite a distance. Its mode of action, again, is through increased susceptibility to the diseases. And the only reason that you're seeing head scab on a uniform basis every year in Canada is because of glyphosate. It occurs sporadically in the past, but you're seeing it every year, essentially, that anytime you have flowering and some precipitation, at the same time you're going to have head scab and the microtoxin. And you're not just seeing it on a part of the head, you see the entire head scab. And some soils,
is there some dangers there as organic growers that we should be looking for? Things that we maybe shouldn't be doing to try to trigger this response?
two things right off that would be to watch for if you be familiar with the symptoms of glyphosate injury. I put those up yesterday. That list that I put up from University of Hawaii and Ohio State, a number of recognized those, mostly for ornamental crops. But bud and fruit drop is probably the most common symptom of glyphosate injury. But those symptoms of nutrient deficiency, sluggish growth, low vigor, so that the important thing in that transition stage, especially, is going to be to keep it immobilized if you have it there, and there are some tests now that are sensitive enough that we can analyze for it. The older tests aren't sensitive enough to, you can get down to a part per million with the GC mass spec, with the Praxis or the ELISA test. You can get down to an anagram now. But, yes. You probably don't need to do that, but what you're going to want to do is you're going to understand your soil because you've been farming for a number of times, so you understand how that soil test relates, or a tissue test relates to your production potential. And rather than shoot for that middle ground, if it's had a high use of glyphosate on that soil before, you're going to want to shoot for the top 3/4 of the range. So, and you look at the ranges of and a soil test or a tissue test, and for corn, Benton or Jones and Mills and their tables for corn, our sufficiency range is anywhere from 25 parts per million to 300 parts per million. And you say, well, does that mean that 25 is the minimum and 300 is the maximum that I should have? It doesn't at all. It just tells you that there are so many environmental variables that come into play that any place in that range could be sufficient for you under your circumstances. That's why it's kind of an empirical approach, but the best ballpark that we can come up with.
So to guard against anything that we may be doing inadvertently by, let's say, putting a whole bunch of manure on our soils that have high phosphorus levels or phosphates.
Manure is an excellent source of your nutrients.
So we don't have to worry about that.
It would be where they've been using the phytase enzyme to increase the availability of phosphorus for the hog. And that's primarily where it's used. But then not realizing that enzyme is very stable and goes right through the hog. And we're seeing situations where it may be very active in the soil and to solubilize the soil phosphorus. Now, it's an excellent source of nutrients. Spent many years on looking at ways that we can improve that nutrient value and timing of application, and those things get some very excellent disease control also.
That's helpful. I just want to understand that.